The choice that changed everything. The clock struck 9:30 p.m. as Sofia Ramirez adjusted the black apron tied around her waist. The weight of the past 10 hours pressed against her aching feet, but she refused to let exhaustion show on her face. It was another Friday night rush at La Bellamy, one of New York City's most renowned fine dining establishments. The air carried the rich aroma of truffle risotto and aged red wine, mingling with the soft hum of jazz music floating from the restaurant speakers. Sofia navigated through the dimly lit dining room with practiced ease, offering warm smiles to guests who barely noticed her presence. For them, she was just a waitress, an invisible part of the evening's luxury. But for Camila, her 12-year-old sister waiting back home, she was everything: a provider, a protector, and the only family she had left. Table 17, Sofia. Important guest. Marcel, the maitre d', whispered as he walked past, his French accent thick but refined. Sofia nodded, straightening her posture and pushing the fatigue away. Important guests meant big tips. Tips meant another month of rent, another week of groceries, and maybe, just maybe, she could finally afford the science textbook Camila needed for school. As she approached table 17, she immediately recognized him. Nicholas Beckett Carter. A name that echoed in business circles like a legend. A self-made millionaire at only 35, known for turning failing companies into billion-dollar successes. He was ruthless, brilliant, and entirely out of place in the warm, intimate ambience of La Bellamy. Dressed in a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, his silver cufflinks glinted under the chandelier light. His thick, dark hair was neatly combed, and his sharp green eyes flicked between his phone screen and the conversation happening at his table. 4 other executives sat with him, their discussions heated with talks of mergers, acquisitions, and market projections. "Good evening, gentlemen," Sofia greeted, keeping her voice poised and professional. "Can I offer you a selection of our finest wines to accompany your meal?" 4 of the men barely acknowledged her, too absorbed in their conversation. But Nicholas looked up, his brows furrowing, as if something was off. His hand loosened his tie slightly, and for a fleeting moment, he looked uneasy. "The Chateau Lafite 2015, he finally said, voice clipped and tense. "And sparkling water for everyone." Sofia noted his stiff posture and the way he exhaled slowly, as if trying to steady himself. She had served enough high-powered guests to know that businessmen like Nicholas rarely let their guard down. Yet there was something off about him tonight, a subtle distress he was trying to mask. Still, it wasn't her business. Her job was to serve, not to interfere. She carried on with her routine, seamlessly tending to other tables, but her gaze flicked back to table 17 every few minutes. Nicholas was shifting uncomfortably, rolling his shoulders, his jaw tightening as the dinner progressed. He wasn't eating much, barely drinking the water, and had gone noticeably pale. Sofia's phone buzzed in her apron pocket. "Camila. Sis, I need the chemistry book by Monday. Ms. Carter says it's mandatory." Sofia sighed. Another $75 for a book. That was half of this week's tips gone. She put her phone away and turned back to table 17 just in time to see Nicholas abruptly push back his chair, gripping the edge of the table as if trying to steady himself. His right hand clutched his chest, and his breathing had become labored. His companions continued talking, completely oblivious. Sofia's heart pounded. She knew the signs: the cold sweat, the clenched jaw, the slight tremble in his hands. This wasn't just stress. Something was seriously wrong. Nicholas pushed himself up as if trying to walk it off, but the moment he took a step, his knees buckled. Without thinking, Sofia lunged forward, catching him before he could hit the floor. A murmur rippled through the restaurant, guests from nearby tables as all eyes turned toward them. "Someone call 911. She shouted, holding Nicholas upright as he gasped for air. For the first time, his powerful green eyes locked onto hers, not with arrogance or control, but with sheer fear. I can't breathe," he wheezed. "Stay with me, Mr. Carter. she urged, lowering him carefully to the ground. Try to focus on my voice. In through your nose, out through your mouth. His fingers dug into her forearm, his grip unsteady. The executives at his table were still frozen, unsure what to do. Sophia didn't hesitate. She had been here before. She had seen this exact same panic in her mother's eyes before the accident that took her life. Not again. She wasn't losing another person. Not tonight. Help is coming, she promised, gently loosening his tie and unbuttoning the collar of his dress shirt so he could breathe easier. Just keep looking at me. The restaurant had fallen silent, the soft jazz music now an ironic contrast to the urgency in the room. A paramedic team rushed in moments later, but to Nicholas, those few minutes had felt like a lifetime. Sophia never let go. As the EMTs assessed him, one of them turned to Sophia. Did he collapse suddenly? Yes, she confirmed, her voice steady despite the chaos. He was pale, short of breath, gripping his chest, but no signs of heart failure. His pulse is erratic, but not absent. The paramedic nodded. Acute stress response, possibly a panic attack, but we'll take him in to be sure. They lifted Nicholas onto a stretcher, but as they wheeled him out, he grabbed Sophia's hand one last time. His grip was weak, his voice even weaker. Thank you, he whispered. For the first time that night, Nicholas Carter looked at her like she was the only person who mattered. And in that moment, as she watched him disappear into the flashing red and blue lights of the ambulance, Sophia knew something had just changed. Not just for him, but for her too. The awakening. The steady, rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor was the first thing Nicholas Carter heard as he drifted back into consciousness. The scent of disinfectant filled the air, crisp and sterile. The warmth of expensive leather chairs was replaced by the cool, stiff sheets of a hospital bed. His body felt strangely light, yet a dull ache pulsed behind his temples. Where the hell am I? His eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the harsh fluorescent lights. The pristine white ceiling loomed overhead, unfamiliar yet oddly calming. He turned his head slightly, groaning at the stiffness in his neck. A nurse in blue scrubs noticed the movement and approached, her expression professional but kind. Good evening, Mr. Carter. You're at Lenox Hill Hospital. How are you feeling? Nicholas tried to speak, but his throat felt dry, like he had swallowed a mouthful of sandpaper. Like I got hit by a truck. His voice came out hoarse, weaker than he liked. He cleared his throat. What happened? The nurse smiled sympathetically. You had an acute stress response. A severe panic attack. A panic attack. That didn't make sense. Nicholas Carter didn't have panic attacks. He was in control, always in control. Yet, the fragmented memories began piecing themselves together. The dinner meeting. The tightness in his chest. The feeling of suffocation. The moment his knees buckled and the waitress. Her face flashed in his mind. Warm brown eyes filled with quiet determination. The way she had held his hand, grounding him when everything else was spiraling. Nicholas forced himself to sit up, ignoring the slight dizziness that followed. He turned to the nurse. The woman at the restaurant, he rasped. The waitress. What's her name? The nurse frowned slightly, flipping through her clipboard. I'm not sure, Mr. Carter. But according to the paramedics, she played a crucial role in keeping you stable until help arrived. Crucial role. Nicholas exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. He could barely remember the last time he had needed help. And yet, when he had been at his weakest, it hadn't been his colleagues, his business partners, or even his security team who had stepped in. It had been her. And she hadn't done it for money, power, or recognition. She had simply acted, without hesitation, without agenda. That realization sat uncomfortably in his chest, like a stone pressing down on his ribs. Nicholas wasn't used to owing people anything, but now he owed her, and that unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. The weight of reality. A few hours later, Nicholas sat upright in his hospital bed, scrolling through his phone. Emails, missed calls, text messages. His assistant, James, had sent at least a dozen updates. James, the board is requesting an urgent meeting regarding the merger. The media is already running stories about your hospitalization. PR team suggests a statement addressing your health. Call me as soon as possible. Nicholas sighed. Even in recovery, his life was a never-ending list of expectations. Control, precision, power. That's what had built his empire. That's what had kept his company on top. But for the first time, he wondered if the cost had been too high. His mind and body had finally rebelled, and he hadn't even seen it coming. Was this how it started? His father had been the same, working himself into the ground until his health failed, until there was nothing left but an empire built on exhaustion and regret. Nicholas closed his eyes, swallowing the uncomfortable lump in his throat. This wasn't just about a panic attack. This was a warning, and if he ignored it, he might not be so lucky next time. An unexpected visit. Nicholas was deep in thought when the door to his hospital room opened. James stepped in, dressed in his usual perfectly pressed suit, carrying a leather folder under his arm. His expression was one of controlled concern. "You look terrible," James said, shutting the door behind him. Nicholas smirked, running a hand over his face. "Nice to see you too." James placed the folder on the bedside table. "The board is worried. The stock price dipped slightly after news of your hospitalization leaked. They want a reassurance statement." Nicholas waved him off. "I'll deal with it later. Right now, I need you to do something else for me." James raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" Nicholas tapped his fingers against the blanket. "Find out the name of the waitress from La Bellamy. The one who helped me." A pause. James hesitated. "Sir, if this is about compensation." "No." Nicholas's voice was firm. "I just need to talk to her." James studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. "I'll see what I can do." As James left, Nicholas exhaled, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in years, he had no agenda. No business play, no calculated move. He just needed to see her. Meanwhile, across the city. At that exact moment, Sofia Ramirez was scrubbing plates in La Bellamy's back kitchen, her mind far away from the chaos of the restaurant. Candleless textbooks, next month's rent, her sore feet, and, against her will, Nicholas Carter. Why did she care? The man was a billionaire. He had resources, an army of doctors, assistants, and lawyers. He probably didn't even remember her name. She had saved him, and now he'd go back to his ivory tower, forgetting her existence. That's how the world worked. People like him and people like her didn't belong in the same stories. And yet she couldn't shake the image of his fear-stricken eyes, the way he had held her hand like it was the only thing tethering him to reality. She let out a slow breath, scrubbing harder. Maybe, for just one moment, Nicholas Carter had felt human. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that Nicholas was already searching for her. That their worlds were about to collide again in ways neither of them could have ever predicted. And that one single act of kindness had just changed the course of both of their lives forever. An offer she couldn't refuse. The search for Sofia and Nicholas never did things halfway. By the time he was discharged from the hospital 2 days later, his assistant James had already found her. Sofia Ramirez, 26 years old, waitress at La Bellamy. Legal guardian to her 12-year-old sister Camila. Parents deceased. Nicholas had stared at the file, his grip tightening around the edges of the paper. The more he read, the more uneasy he felt. Sofia wasn't just another employee at the restaurant. She was a fighter, someone who had taken responsibility for a child when she barely had enough for herself. And yet, when she'd saved his life, she hadn't expected anything in return. That baffled him. Everyone had a price. He'd spent years building an empire based on that very principle. But Sofia, she'd walked away from his money, his gratitude, his world. And for the first time in years, Nicholas had no idea how to handle someone like her. But that didn't mean he wouldn't try. A second encounter. Nicholas didn't send his assistant. He didn't make a call. He went to her. That evening, La Bellamy was packed as usual. The dim glow of chandeliers reflected off crystal glasses, the scent of truffles and roasted duck filling the air. Nicholas entered the restaurant, his presence commanding even without trying. Dressed in a simple black cashmere coat over his tailored suit, he cut a striking figure against the candlelit setting. Heads turned. The maitre, Marcel, approached immediately. "Mr. Carter, welcome back. I trust you're feeling better." Nicholas nodded. "I need to speak to Sophia Ramirez." Marcel hesitated, glancing toward the back of the restaurant where Sophia was busy clearing plates. Nicholas followed his gaze and spotted her instantly. Tired, focused, completely unaware of him. She wasn't wearing a fancy dress or a designer outfit, just a simple black uniform with an apron. But she had more presence than anyone in the room. She looked real. Nicholas didn't wait for permission. He strode toward her. Sophia had just set down an empty tray when she felt a presence looming beside her. She turned, and her stomach dropped. Nicholas Carter, standing inches away, looking down at her with those unreadable green eyes, his suit crisp, his very existence a stark contrast to the world she lived in. Oh, hell no. She didn't have time for this. "Mr. Carter," she said, forcing a polite tone, "are you here to dine or just to intimidate the waitstaff?" A flicker of amusement passed through his gaze. "Neither. I came to talk." Sophia exhaled sharply. "If you're here to hand me an envelope full of cash, you can turn around right now. It's not about money." That caught her off guard. She crossed her arms. "Then what do you want?" Nicholas hesitated, as if the answer was foreign to him. "I don't know, but I do know I owe you something, more than just a thank you." She shook her head. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Carter. You had a panic attack. I helped. End of story. It's not the end." His voice was lower now, more serious. "Not for me." Sophia stared at him, trying to decipher his motives. A man like Nicholas Carter didn't just show up at a waitress's job without an agenda. "I'm working," she finally said. "If this conversation isn't about ordering food, I don't have time for it." Nicholas studied her for a moment. Then, with the confidence of a man who had never heard the word no, he took out his business card and slid it onto the tray she was holding. "When you're ready to talk, call me." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Sophia stunned, frustrated, and more intrigued than she wanted to admit. The proposition. For 3 days, she stared at the card. Nicholas Carter, CEO, Carter Industries, a number that looked like it led straight to the president himself. She had no intention of calling him, and yet when Camila got sick, everything changed. Her sister came home from school with a high fever, shivering under the blankets. The doctor's visit was $150. The medication, another $60. And the bills, they never stopped. That night, as she sat by Camila's bedside, watching her little sister's face flushed with fever, Sophia made a choice. The next morning, she pulled out the card and dialed the number. It rang once, twice. Then, Carter. Sophia swallowed. "It's Sophia." There was a pause. Then his voice softened slightly. "I was starting to think you wouldn't call." She took a deep breath. "I'm listening. What do you want?" "Meet me tomorrow, 10 a.m. my office." Sophia hesitated. "If this is some charity offer." "It's not," Nicholas interrupted. "It's a job offer. The meeting that changed everything." The next morning, Sophia stepped into the glass tower of Carter Industries. The office was breathtaking, floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the city skyline, sleek modern furniture, everything immaculate. Nicholas was already waiting for her, standing near the windows. He turned when she entered, eyeing her carefully. You came. Sophia crossed her arms. I don't have all day, Mr. Carter. What's this job? He gestured for her to sit. My assistant, James, is moving up. I need someone sharp, who can handle pressure, keep up with me, and more importantly, won't be afraid to challenge me when I need it. Sophia raised an eyebrow. And you think I'm that person? Nicholas leaned forward slightly. You're the only person who's ever said no to me. That makes you perfect for the job. She let out a short laugh. I have no experience as an executive assistant. I don't need experience. I need competence. And I know you have it. Sophia studied him. What's the catch? Nicholas met her gaze. You'd be working for me. Close quarters. Long hours. No special treatment. No handouts. Just the job. Do it well, and you'll have more than enough to take care of Camilla without working double shifts at the restaurant. At the mention of Camilla, Sophia stiffened. He had done his research. And damn him, he knew exactly how to get to her. She exhaled. I'll think about it. Nicholas smirked. You've got until tomorrow. Sophia turned to leave but paused at the door. If I take this job, I won't be your charity case. Nicholas's gaze softened. I never thought you were. As she walked out of his office, Sophia knew one thing. Her life was about to change forever. A world of fire and ice. Sophia Ramirez had walked into many challenges in her life. Becoming the legal guardian of her 12-year-old sister at 23 had been the hardest. Balancing double shifts to keep a roof over their heads had been exhausting. Navigating a world that favored power and wealth while she barely had enough to pay rent had been a battle. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared her for working under Nicholas Carter. Day 1. Welcome to the Lion's Den. The moment Sophia stepped into Carter Industries, she felt like a trespasser. The office screamed wealth, marble floors, glass walls, city views so breathtaking they barely looked real. The air smelled of polished wood and espresso, the quiet hum of high-stakes business filling the space. At the reception desk, a blonde woman in an impeccable gray suit arched a perfectly shaped eyebrow. You must be Miss Ramirez. Sophia nodded. First day. Where do I start? The woman, who introduced herself as Emily, head of operations, gave her a sharp once-over before leading her down a long corridor toward Nicholas's private office. Mr. Carter is a demanding employer, Emily said. You'll need to be 3 steps ahead of him at all times. Sophia smirked. I'll keep up. Emily chuckled. We'll see. She knocked twice before pushing open the heavy doors. Nicholas stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his silhouette framed against the morning skyline. He wore his usual custom-tailored suit, but today the tie was loosened slightly, an almost imperceptible break in his otherwise perfect exterior. He turned, eyes locking onto Sophia's. For a fraction of a second, something flickered between them. Awareness. Tension. Then it was gone. You're late, he said. Sophia glanced at the clock. 8:59 a.m. She met his gaze without blinking. No, I'm not. The corner of his mouth twitched, but he didn't respond. James, his former assistant, stepped in, handing her a tablet filled with calendars, contracts, and upcoming meetings. I'll be training you for the next week before I transition to my new position, James said. First rule. Nicholas doesn't like to repeat himself. Nicholas leaned against his desk, arms crossed. Second rule. If you can't keep up, don't waste my time. Sophia smiled. A slow, almost challenging smile. Don't worry, Mr. Carter. I don't waste time. James coughed, clearly hiding a laugh. Nicholas's green eyes darkened, but he simply turned back to his desk. Let's get started. The chaos of power. By mid-afternoon, Sophia understood why Nicholas Carter's assistants rarely lasted long. He was relentless. Meetings back-to-back, negotiations that required split-second decisions, high-stakes phone calls where billions of dollars were discussed as if they were pocket change. He didn't slow down, didn't explain things twice, and expected perfection. By 5 p.m., Sophia had managed to reorganize his entire weekly schedule, handle a last-minute crisis with a supplier, memorize his coffee order, shut down an entitled executive who tried to bypass protocol. Nicholas had watched the last part with amusement. "You're enjoying this," he said after she'd sent the executive walking. Sophia shrugged. "You hired me to be efficient, right?" He studied her, his gaze unreadable. "That remains to be seen." For the first time, Sophia understood why he was feared in business. He wasn't cruel, but he was ruthless, a man who saw the world in terms of strategies and leverage. And yet, there were moments, small, fleeting moments, where she caught glimpses of the man beneath the polished CEO exterior. The way his shoulders tensed when he talked about his father. The way his fingers drummed against the desk when he was lost in thought. The way he stole quick glances at her when he thought she wouldn't notice. Sophia ignored it. She was here to work, not to unravel the enigma that was Nicholas Carter. But the more time she spent around him, the harder that became. The breaking point. By Friday, Sophia had found her rhythm. She knew how to anticipate Nicholas's needs before he even asked. She knew when to push back and when to let things go. She had even learned to read his moods, the difference between frustration and exhaustion, between anger and silence. But Nicholas, he wasn't used to her. He wasn't used to anyone challenging him. And that led to their first real fight. Friday, 8 p.m. Office showdown. Sophia stood in front of Nicholas's desk, arms crossed, refusing to back down. "You need to cancel tomorrow's meetings." Nicholas barely looked up from his laptop. "No." Sophia sighed, rubbing her temples. "You had a panic attack 5 days ago. You need rest." His jaw tightened. "I don't have time for rest." "Then make time." Silence. Nicholas leaned back in his chair, studying her like she was a puzzle he couldn't solve. "You think you understand my life?" he asked. Sophia met his gaze. "I understand burnout, and I understand what happens when you ignore it." Nicholas exhaled, rubbing his fingers together in thought. He wasn't used to people telling him what to do. He wasn't used to people caring. "You're persistent," he murmured. Sophia smirked. "Get used to it." For a moment, he just stared at her. Then, without breaking eye contact, he closed his laptop. "Fine. Cancel the morning meetings. But don't push your luck, Ramirez." Sophia grinned. "Noted." As she turned to leave, Nicholas called after her. "Sophia." She paused. "Yes?" His voice was softer now. "Thank you." Sophia hesitated for half a second before nodding. "Try to get some sleep, Carter." Then she walked out, leaving Nicholas staring after her, wondering how the hell she had managed to get under his skin so fast. Saturday morning. An unfamiliar feeling. Nicholas Carter never took days off. His world thrived on precision, efficiency, and control. Every hour of his day was accounted for, every decision meticulously planned. So when he woke up on Saturday morning with no meetings lined up, he felt restless. He sat at the edge of his bed in his penthouse apartment, staring out at the city skyline. The sun had barely risen, casting golden light over the streets below. Normally, he'd be checking his emails, preparing for his next deal, calculating his next move. Instead, he found himself thinking about her. Sophia Ramirez, the woman who had somehow forced him to slow down. His fingers tapped against his knee. Why was she different? Nicholas had encountered thousands of people in his life. Executives, employees, investors. Everyone wanted something. But Sophia, she had challenged him. She had seen past the wealth, past the control, and instead of trying to impress him or take advantage of him, she had stood her ground. And worse, he respected her for it. Saturday afternoon. A surprise at the cafe. By noon, Nicholas had had enough of sitting still. He threw on a dark sweater, a gray coat, and sunglasses, Anything to make him look slightly less like Nicholas Carter, CEO of Carter Industries. He stepped out onto the busy Manhattan streets, unsure where he was going, until his feet led him to a small cafe near Central Park. And there she was, Sophia, sitting by the window, a cup of coffee in her hands, staring at something on her phone with a deep, concentrated frown. She wasn't in her usual waitress uniform, or the sharp, polished look she wore at work. Instead, she had on a simple, oversized sweater, her dark hair falling loosely over her shoulders. She looked different, softer. Nicholas hesitated. He could walk away. He could pretend he hadn't seen her. But instead, he stepped inside. The cafe bell jingled as the door swung shut behind him. Sophia looked up, and her eyes widened in surprise. "Carter." Nicholas smirked. "I believe most people call me Nicholas on weekends." She arched an eyebrow. "And here I thought you didn't believe in weekends." Nicholas pulled off his sunglasses, sliding into the chair across from her without waiting for an invitation. "I don't," he admitted, "but someone forced me to take the morning off." Sophia rolled her eyes. "You're welcome." The warmth of the cafe wrapped around them as silence settled. For once, Nicholas wasn't in a boardroom, wasn't negotiating a billion-dollar deal. It was just him and Sophia. And strangely, that felt more like a battle than any corporate war he'd ever fought. A conversation neither of them expected. Sophia took a slow sip of her coffee, her eyes studying him carefully. "So, let me guess," she said. "You woke up, realized you had no meetings, and panicked." Nicholas let out a soft chuckle. "Something like that." She shook her head, half amused. "You're addicted to work. And you're addicted to proving people wrong," he countered. She smirked. "I don't need to prove anything to anyone." Nicholas leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table. "That's the difference between us. Then, my entire world is built on proving something. Winning. Control." Sophia tilted her head. "And what happens when you don't win?" That was the real question, wasn't it? Nicholas was silent for a moment before answering. "I don't lose." Sophia scoffed. "Right. Of course not." Nicholas exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know how to slow down, Sophia. It's never been an option for me." Her expression softened. "It is now." He met her gaze, and for the first time, he wished he could believe her. Saturday evening. A line crossed. The city had begun to glow as evening set in, golden lights reflecting off the skyscrapers. Nicholas walked with Sophia through Central Park, something he hadn't done in years. Just a simple stroll. No agenda. No business deals. "Tell me something," he said, hands in his pockets. "Why did you refuse the money I offered you after the restaurant?" Sophia glanced at him, her breath visible in the crisp air. "Because not everything in life is a transaction, Carter. Everything is a transaction. Not kindness." He frowned, as if the concept was foreign to him. Sophia stopped walking, turning to face him. "You were vulnerable that night. It wasn't about money or power. It was about you needing someone." Nicholas let out a slow breath. "That's a dangerous thing, needing people." Sophia sighed. "No, it's human." They stared at each other, the space between them dangerously thin. For the first time, Nicholas wasn't thinking about control, about power, about winning. He was thinking about her. Sophia's lips parted slightly, her breath uneven. He didn't know who moved first. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was her. But suddenly, they were too close. Nicholas reached out, fingers brushing against her cheek. "Sophia." And then, just as quickly as the moment came, Sophia stepped back. Her eyes were guarded, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "We can't do this." Nicholas's jaw tightened. "Why not?" "Because you don't know how to let go of control, Nicholas, and I don't know how to be part of a world where I'm just another piece in a game." She turned, walking away before he could say anything else. Nicholas stood there, watching her go, feeling something he had never felt before. Loss. He had closed countless business deals, won negotiations worth billions. But tonight, he had lost something more valuable than all of them combined. And for the first time in his life, he had no idea how to fix it. The gala that changed everything. A dangerous invitation. For the next week, Nicholas Carter and Sofia Ramirez existed in a fragile truce. At work, they kept their interactions professional. Emails were exchanged, schedules were managed, deadlines were met. But something had shifted since that night in Central Park. The air between them was thicker, heavier with unsaid words and unfinished moments. Sofia pretended she didn't notice the way Nicholas watched her when he thought she wasn't looking. Nicholas pretended he wasn't counting the days since she last said his name like it meant something. And then, just when they had finally settled into this uneasy rhythm, Nicholas threw everything off balance again. The invitation. "You're attending the Carter Industries annual gala," Nicholas announced one afternoon, not even looking up from his laptop. Sofia, who had been reviewing his schedule for the week, froze mid-sentence. "Excuse me?" Nicholas leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping against the desk. "You heard me." Sofia crossed her arms. "And why exactly would I be attending a gala filled with millionaires and billionaires?" Nicholas met her gaze. "Because you work for me, and you're my executive assistant. It's expected." Sofia raised an eyebrow. "And it has nothing to do with you wanting me there." His jaw twitched. "It's business, Ramirez." Liar. Sofia knew better. She knew this wasn't about business. It wasn't about her job. This was about them, the undefined, unspoken thing between them. And worse, she was tempted. Very, very tempted. A dress that changed everything. The night of the gala arrived too fast. Sofia stood in front of her bedroom mirror, staring at the black dress Camilla had forced her to buy earlier that week. "You have to go," Camilla had insisted, practically shoving her into the fitting room. "If nothing else, just go and show Carter what he's missing." Sofia had rolled her eyes, but now, standing here, seeing herself in the dress, she had to admit, her sister had a point. The dress was elegant, hugging her curves without being too revealing. A slit ran along the side, stopping just above her knee, adding a touch of danger to the otherwise classic look. Her dark hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, her makeup simple but striking. She looked like she belonged at a billionaire's gala, even if, deep down, she knew she didn't. The moment he saw her. The Carter Industries Gala was held at the Plaza Hotel, a night of luxury designed to impress the most powerful people in the world. Men in perfectly tailored tuxedos, women in custom designer gowns, champagne that cost more than her rent. Sofia stepped through the grand entrance, her heart pounding. She wasn't nervous because of the event itself. She was nervous because of him. And then, just as if she had summoned him with a thought, Nicholas Carter turned. Their eyes met across the ballroom. And the moment he saw her, everything changed. Nicholas had been standing with a group of investors, effortlessly charming them. But the second he laid eyes on Sofia in that dress, every conversation faded into static. For a man who prided himself on control, the sight of her standing there, elegant, strong, utterly breathtaking, shattered every ounce of it. She wasn't just beautiful. She was something else entirely, something he had never wanted so badly, yet had no idea how to claim. Sofia saw the shift in his expression. For the first time since she met him, Nicholas Carter looked lost. And that was dangerous, because it meant she wasn't the only one affected. The dance that shouldn't have happened. The night blurred in a whirlwind of introductions, polite conversation, and forced smiles. Sofia was aware of Nicholas's presence the entire time. The way his gaze followed her. The way his jaw clenched when another man got too close. The way his fingers tightened around his whiskey glass every time she laughed at someone else's joke. It was a game neither of them wanted to play, but they were playing it anyway. And then, as if the universe itself was conspiring against them. The band started playing a slow, intoxicating melody. Nicholas appeared at her side before she could protest. "Dance with me." It wasn't a request. Sophia's breath caught as his hand extended toward hers, waiting. This was a mistake. She knew it, but she still took his hand. And when Nicholas Carter pulled her onto the dance floor, the world fell away. His hand rested on her lower back, his fingers just barely brushing the bare skin where her dress dipped low. Sophia's pulse raced. "You shouldn't be holding me like this," she murmured. Nicholas's voice was lower, rougher than usual. "And yet, you haven't let go." She swallowed hard, refusing to look up at him. People are watching. Nicholas didn't care. Let them. The song was too slow, too intimate, and every shift of their bodies brought them closer. Sophia hated this. She hated that she could feel the warmth of his breath against her temple. She hated that her heart was pounding in ways she didn't understand. She hated that she was losing the very control she had worked so hard to keep. And then he spoke. Softly, quietly, like a confession. "I haven't stopped thinking about you." Her breath hitched. "Nicholas, since that night in the park, since before then, if I'm being honest." Asterisk, asterisk. His fingers pressed just a little firmer against her waist. "Tell me you haven't thought about it, too." Sophia's throat tightened. She could lie. She could pretend. But deep down, they both knew the truth. She had. She had thought about him. About this. About what it would feel like to let herself fall. And that terrified her. Because Nicholas Carter was a man who collected victories. And Sophia wasn't interested in being another one of them. The aftermath. The song ended. The spell broke. Sophia pulled away before Nicholas could say anything else. "This is dangerous," she whispered. "Whatever this is, it's not a good idea." Nicholas stared at her, his expression unreadable. "And yet, you're still here." She swallowed hard. Not for long. Then she turned and walked away, leaving Nicholas standing there, fists clenched, heart pounding. For the first time in his life, Nicholas Carter didn't know how to win. Because this wasn't a business deal. This was Sophia, and he had no idea how to make her stay. The fight for something real. The aftermath of the gala. Nicholas Carter had never been the type to chase after anything. Deals, opportunities, power. He created them, controlled them, bent them to his will. But Sophia Ramirez, she was slipping through his fingers, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know how to stop it. After she walked away from the gala, Nicholas spent the rest of the night pretending to care about business conversations and charity auctions. But in reality, his mind was stuck on one thing. Her. The way she had felt in his arms during the dance. The way her breath had hitched when he told her the truth. The way she had run, not because she didn't feel something, but because she did. And that scared him. But he wasn't about to let her go without a fight. The next morning, a storm brewing. Sophia didn't sleep. Not after the gala, not after the dance, not after the way Nicholas had looked at her, like she was something he wasn't ready to lose. It was dangerous. She was dangerous. Because the moment she let herself fall, Nicholas Carter would become something she couldn't control. And she had spent too many years fighting for control in a world that had tried to take it from her. So when she walked into Carter Industries the next morning, she had already made a decision. She was going to quit. Before things went too far. Before she lost herself in something that could never be simple. But the moment she stepped into the office, Nicholas was already waiting for her. His sleeves were rolled up, his tie missing, his green eyes stormy with something unreadable. "We need to talk." Sophia exhaled sharply, gripping the resignation letter in her hand. "Nicholas, No." His voice was firm, unwavering. "Not like this. Not with a resignation letter. You don't get to walk away without giving me a damn reason." Sophia's pulse hammered in her chest. She knew this was coming. She knew he wouldn't let her leave without a fight. And yet, she had to force herself to say the words. This isn't working. Nicholas took a step closer, towering over her, his presence like fire and ice all at once. Why? Because I can't do this. She swallowed hard. I can't work for you while. His jaw clenched. While what, Sophia? Her breath hitched. While wanting something I shouldn't want. Silence. A heavy, charged silence that pressed against them like a storm waiting to break. Nicholas's green eyes darkened, then stopped fighting it. Sophia shook her head. You don't understand. Then make me understand. His voice was rough now, low and filled with something she wasn't ready to name. She took a step back, forcing distance between them. You don't know what it's like, Nicholas, to fight for every damn thing in your life. To not have the luxury of making mistakes. I can't afford to fall for someone like you. Nicholas's expression tightened, something dangerous flickering behind his gaze. Someone like me? Yes. She exhaled. Someone who doesn't know how to love without controlling. Someone who has never had to worry about what happens after the fall. His jaw clenched. You think I don't know how to lose. His voice was quiet now, but there was something raw in it. You think I haven't lost before. Sophia swallowed. Not like me. Nicholas's fists tightened at his sides. I lost my mother when I was 8. Sophia. She left, and I spent years wondering what I did wrong. My father buried himself in work, and I spent my life trying to prove I was enough. Enough to keep people from leaving. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected that. Nicholas never talked about his past. And now, here he was, giving her a part of himself that no one else had ever seen. I don't know how to love the way you want me to. His voice was quieter now, almost vulnerable. But I want to try. Her heart ached. Because she wanted that too. But she was too scared to take the risk. So she did the only thing she knew how to do. She ran. Again. A goodbye that wasn't really goodbye. The next day, Sophia submitted her resignation. Nicholas didn't fight it. Not because he wanted her to leave, but because he knew she needed space. And for the first time, he let her go, even though it killed him. Days passed. Then a week. Then 2. And still, Nicholas Carter felt her absence like a missing limb. His office was too quiet, his schedule too predictable, and his life. It felt empty. The train station. Nicholas found out through James that Sophia and Camilla were leaving New York, moving to Boston, where Sophia had been offered a scholarship to finish her degree. She was getting a fresh start. Without him. But Nicholas was done letting her go. So on the day of her departure, he found himself standing in Penn Station, heart racing as he searched for her. And then he saw her, standing near the departure board, her suitcases neatly stacked beside her. She hadn't seen him yet. Nicholas took a deep breath, then walked forward. And when Sophia finally turned and met his gaze, her eyes widened. What are you doing here? Nicholas stopped a few feet away, watching her carefully. I could ask you the same thing. Sophia sighed. Nicholas. Come back. His voice was quiet, but firm. Stay. She shook her head, looking away. I can't. Why? Because I need to do this. For me. For Camilla. Nicholas exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I know. His voice was raw. But I also know that I don't want a life where you're not in it. Her breath hitched. You can't just. I love you, Sophia. She froze. He had said it. No walls. No control. Just truth. I love you, he repeated, stepping closer. And if you need Boston, I'll follow. If you need space, I'll wait. But don't walk away thinking you're alone in this. Sophia swallowed hard, tears burning her eyes. She had spent so long running, so long fighting for control. And now, for the first time, she wondered, what if love wasn't about control? What if it was about choosing someone despite the fear? She reached out, fingers trembling, and took his hand. Then stay, she whispered. Stay with me. And as Nicholas pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was the only thing that mattered, Sophia finally let herself fall. Because love wasn't about winning or losing. It was about choosing. And they had chosen each other.